everyone. Welcome to The Download, where we bring you discussion and analysis from a Catholic perspective. Today is Wednesday, September 6th, 2023. It is Wednesday, my dudes, and I'm Simon Wraith, here with my two co-hosts, Trey Brock and Brad Eli. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was born in 1881 in central France. He became a Jesuit priest and he wrote extensively about mankind evolving towards a final spiritual singularity, towards unity. Weird theories, weird blending of science and Christianity. Time and again, church authorities forbade Catholic bookstores from selling his writings and Catholic libraries from keeping his books on the shelves. In the 1940s, Rome banned him from writing or teaching on philosophy. In 1962, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith condemned some of Teilhard's works. The congregation said his writings, quote, are replete with ambiguities, or rather with serious errors which offend Christian doctrine. But is the current pope subtly trying to rehabilitate de Chardin? In recent comments on an airplane back from Mongolia, Pope Francis spoke highly of the deceased Jesuit. The pontiff remarks at one point, this priest, often misunderstood, has intuited that the Eucharist is always in some way celebrated on the altar of the world and is the living center of the universe, the overflowing core of love and of inexhaustible life, even in times like our own, marked by conflicts and wars. He went on to quote a prayer by de Chardin, which reads, quote, radiant word, blazing power, you who mold the manifold so as to breathe life into it, I pray you, lay on us those your hands, powerful, considerate, omnipresent. Okay, so that is probably one of the weirdest things I've ever had to read on the download. It's just like a prayer. It sounds like some sort of, bizarre thing that you would see, some, yoga Karen, I think was what Dave Gordon called them. These, women who are latching onto some wackadoodle spirituality or something. But yeah, this wasn't the only thing that he did, was it? Yeah,
the problem with the current administration is we have very little. We're taking down all the barriers, all of the safeguards, all of the guardrails, you might say, all of the caution signs. Nothing, you can read anything you want, talk to anybody you want, mix with anything you want, and all of this will somehow lead you to the higher truth. Well, you got to realize that, talking with a mathematician who says 2 + 2 is 3 and 2 + 2 is 5 and, 2 + 2, we don't even know what it is, probably isn't going to lead you to a higher understanding of mathematics. And the same with Teilhard. The more you get into Teilhard as far as actually understanding about him, the more you're like, oh, man. The guy was pantheist. He was a mystic. Now, let's go back to a little bit of his earlier beginning. The Pope Francis actually is talking about the Mass on the world. A lot of popes kind of dip into there a little bit. Nobody's wrong all the time, even a broken clock, right? So you can go in and kind of, get a little something. What Marilyn Manson, he's the shock rocker, right?
Yes, one of the many.
Well, those guys will actually put in some little, tidbits in there that are, real nice little thing, and they'll brag about how people latch onto that, and they'll reel in people to that and gets into the darker side. Well, that's very demonic and all of that, but you can pick up anybody's book and find something in there, especially when it's written in all this equivocal, vague, ambiguous, strange, mystic terminology. It's kind of like an ink blot. You kind of look into it and see what you want to see.
See what you want to see.
That's where a lot of these moderns are doing their stuff, is ink blots.
And it wasn't that the reason for the Vatican cracking down on him was because of the ambiguity. I'm sure there were heresies in there, but wasn't that the main reason they condemned his work, because it was so ambiguous?
Well, they actually did say serious errors that actually are like, okay, there's a problem with what you got going on here. One, he had such a template, total template of evolution. Mm-hmm. Everything had to be evolution with him. That was a first principle with him. If you don't agree with evolution as a first principle, then we don't have anything to discuss, and he didn't want to discuss anything with you. Mm-hmm. Well, the problem with that, even evolution, I was just before the show, I discovered in England is where his Piltdown hoax actually fell apart.
You've talked about that before on the.
I think I might have said Peking Man, but with Piltdown Man.
Yeah, so this is quite a famous case within anthropology and archaeology and all this sort of stuff.
And Chardin was a paleontologist.
He was a paleontologist.
So he was all into this stuff.
All into this sort of stuff. But the Piltdown hoax was a skull, the upper skull of a human, and there was a jaw attached to it that was very ape-like. And so, of course, that people were, for a long period in kind of the early part of the 20th century, paleontologists were looking for the so-called missing link, because there was this idea that, well, mankind had evolved from apes, which is like, well, that's not what Darwin said, but loads of people didn't read Darwin and just kind of were looking for this thing that was kind of half man, half ape. And so they were looking for this. And they found this skull with this head. The skull itself looked like the skull of a man, and the jaw looked very ape-like. And people were like, it is the missing link, it's the missing link. Total fabrication. Turns out that this is just a regular human skull that has been stained with tea or some such to make it look dark, and it's an orangutan jaw that they filed the teeth down a bit so they look a bit more human. So what it had done is this had actually set paleontology and our understanding of perhaps the origin of man and all these kind of things, all this information, set it back years, and it's just a complete fabrication. It wasn't real. And Desjardins was kind of all up in it, wasn't
he? He was people who have actually studied this, who are credible sources, have confirmed that he actually was involved with complicity. He was in cahoots with this whole thing, knowing what the origins were all about and all of that. So his complicity in that totally undermines his credibility in other areas, and that's a big thing right there. His mom was really into mysticism, so he wasn't so much about we're going to be talking later on this week about the rosary and effective prayer and all this, but he wasn't into that type of prayer. He was more into the mystic, Gnostic type, almost like Eastern mysticism type thing. Shirley MacLaine, Ride the Vibes Through the Universe type of thing. That's what we're talking about. I mean, really, see, he was more of that than Shirley MacLaine was. And so the idea, and then this pantheism, this book here, that the Mass on the World, he will be talking about the cosmic Christ. He'll be talking about the omega point, and we're all evolving into this. But what he means by that is we are emanations of God. We are evolving into, God is changing. Process theology, God changes as we change. And that was all just wackadoodle stuff. But it was such the rage with this whole evolutionary era. When you have that filter, everything has to be evolving, and we're all evolving. It's all so trippy and cool, and you never really spell anything out. You don't talk in any Catholic terms, so you can't violate Catholic things as much. Mm-hmm. But Rahner was the same way, a Jesuit. He didn't want to talk about nature and grace. He wanted to talk about the supernatural existential. Yeah. And, graced nature and all this. So these guys knew how to bend the whole reality of theology.
Well, so Dietrich von Hildebrand, speaking of nature and grace, Dietrich von Hildebrand, who he interacted with Teilhard de Chardin, and for background, Dietrich von Hildebrand was called by Pope Pius XII the 20th century doctor of the church. Now, von Hildebrand is not a doctor of the church, but that's what he called him. Pope Benedict also referred to him as something along the lines of the most prominent theologian, Catholic philosopher of the 20th century. And so this is what he has to say. He says that so Dietrich is talking about Desjardins. He says he, Teilhard, ignored completely the decisive difference between nature and supernature. And then he recalls a conversation he had privately with Chardin, and after he had critiqued some of the things that he was saying, and he said, when our talk touched on St. Augustine, he exclaimed violently, "Don't mention that unfortunate man. He spoiled everything by introducing the supernatural." So, I'm no Teilhard de Chardin expert, but just based on that one quote alone, I mean, that's, there's a million problems that pop up there.
The reason he ignored the difference between nature and supernature, man and God, is because there was that unifying thing called pantheism, where we're all that, and it's such a violation for him to actually look down on matter. Yeah. Matter was not matter for him. Matter was God for him, and we're all part of that matter. And that's where he's coming from. And that was scary. He even declares himself a pantheist.
Well, yeah, and this is what people don't understand. You cannot separate nature and grace. You can't separate philosophy and theology. You don't separate faith and reason. So nature and grace, the relationship there, grace doesn't destroy nature, it perfects it. Philosophy is the handmaid of theology. Faith and reason, they're in perfect harmony with each other. And that's why St. Thomas Aquinas, he says, if something is found in the sayings of philosophers which is contrary to faith, then it is not philosophy, but rather the abuse of philosophy resulting from a defect of reason. This is why the church goes back and points out these false philosophies like fideism, which says that essentially you need faith. It doesn't say it essentially. It says that you need faith in order to know things like God exists. That was condemned in St. Paul's first letter to the Romans. It's condemned in Vatican I, that you can know that God exists based on reason alone, looking around the natural world and coming to certain conclusions. And then the opposite of that would be rationalism, right? Where reason essentially replaces faith, and you just need reason in order to become complete as a human being and be fulfilled as a human being. And the reason that's like vitally important is because it undermines the whole essence of the faith. God comes down to man and lowers himself to our nature in order to lift us up to his nature. That's the whole point of the faith. And so when you separate those two, or you act like one is not important and the other one is, it completely undermines the essence of the Catholic faith. It undermines the essence of humanity itself.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, of course, you mentioned pantheism a couple of times, Brad, and pantheism is obviously, theism is relating to God. That's obviously why we talk about this. So we talk about atheism, which is without God and that sort of thing. But pantheism is pan is all, is what it means, and you see that in various words. As pan is meaning that, and so the idea that all is God. So matter is God and we are God, and there is no, as you said, Brad, there's no distinction there between us and God. And I think that is, of course, it's a very grave evil, just as an underlying philosophy, to say, well, there is no distinction between us and God, because then then there's no distinction between us and somebody else. There's no distinction between the sacred and the profane. There's no distinction between the natural and the supernatural. Nothing is unique. Nothing is particular. Nothing is actually distinct from anything else.
But it's the diabolic temptation to be like unto God. Pantheism is that perfect temptation that I am God. I am an emanation from God. I'm evolving into God. I can become God. That's the age-old, you will be like unto God, knowing the good and evil. That was and I got to bring this up because this just blew me away when I found out about this. In the Heart of the Matter was written around 1950. I'd have to check that. Published posthumously. I think Teilhard died in about 1955. On page 66, he's talking about as a young man, this is an experience that he had. And it was very paranormal, and it became a solidifying moment in his journey, in his viewpoint of pantheism, of evolution, and all of that. From then on, it was like, he's on. He's talking about, and now in the very depths of the being, it had invaded. He was talking about going across the desert, and this thing came over him. He calls it the thing. He calls it, you can find this online, PDF, The Heart of the Matter, page 66.
The thing.
On page 66, for crying out loud. Okay.
6th paragraph.
Anyway. And now in the very depths of the being, it had invaded. The tempest of life, infinitely gentle, infinitely brutal, was murmuring to the one secret point in the soul which it had not altogether demolished. You called me, here I am, driven by the Spirit, far from humanity's caravan routes. You dared to venture into the untouched wilderness, grown weary of abstractions, of attenuations, of the worldliness of social life. You wanted to pit yourself against reality, entire and untamed. You had need of me in order to grow, and I was waiting for you in order to be made holy. That's something out of Nefarious.
That is a bit scary, isn't it?
That's only a little tiny section. You should read farther and more of that. And it's like,
I'm not sure
my hair is standing up.
I'm not sure I want to.
He's looking back at that as the defining moment of his life, and he's saying that from then on, matter was living, and he understood that matter was living. That solidified his pantheism and this whole evolution. And it was the first principle after that. If you don't have an evolutionary viewpoint, we don't have anything to talk about.
Yeah.
I don't need to prove it to you because it is a first principle. You don't think that, and that's what it was for him.
It's interesting. I mean, there's another thing that I would just point, because look, a lot of this stuff, people are going to be there going, okay, you've got this guy who's kind of this obscure philosopher, and he's really, wackadoodly saying a bunch of stuff that's clearly crazy. Well, okay, they're saying, I'm not going to be listening to that because I'm, a good Catholic and stuff, and I not reading his books anyway. I wouldn't go and read that. People are reading, Fulton Sheen, et cetera, and all this kind of, good stuff. But the thing is that firstly, Desjardins is an influence on the people who are coming and saying these things today. These people who are
like the Pope,
but others as well. I mean, like your parish priest when he comes out and he's kind of, we're not going to have such a big distinction with regard to the sacred space of the sanctuary and the body of the church. So the altar rail goes. So we're going to get rid of that. Well, it's fine. Yeah, we'll have lectors and we'll have people reading and we'll have ministers of Holy Communion and so forth because there's not so much of a difference. We're going to have altar girls and altar servers and this sort of stuff because there's not a distinction and a difference. We're going to have a mass that is looking very much like a meal, a communal meal, rather than a sacrifice. Again, it's like so that the eating of the Eucharist becomes not dissimilar from the eating of a cracker. And so what you have here is you have this which Desjardins was putting out as pantheism, that all things are God and God is all things.
And we're all evolving into that.
The sort of the step down from that, the watered down philosophy of that is there isn't really a distinction between persons. So there's not a distinction between the priest and the laity. There's not a distinction between the Eucharist and ordinary food. There's not a distinction between sacraments and other sorts of prayer.
It's a new age thing. We're a universal consciousness. And that wackadoodle thing that infects all these Jesuits like Ronner and that, I was in Holy Apostles. We both, Trey and I have been at Holy Apostles. And there was a good priest there, Father David Liptak. Good priest. I'm not saying anything bad about him. And it was a class on anointing of the sick. And when can you anoint? So the body and soul have to separate, right? And so I'm sitting there in class, and he's just bringing up St. Thomas, the hylomorphic theory of the body is the soul is the form of the body, and so forth. And the body, soul separate. Anyway, then he brings up Ronner. And this is what I'm talking about, these Jesuits, crazy Jesuits from the 50s. And he says, for Ronner, the relationship between the body and soul is a pan-cosmic relationship. I don't know what he meant by that. I don't think he did either.
That's perfect.
I'm telling you, that's a direct quote. And I'll tell you what he meant was he's saying he was touching on something so deep, so profound, so mystical, so higher knowledge that even he couldn't grasp the depth of his profundity when he uttered this. Okay? And I'm like, dude, if you don't know what he meant, why bring it up? But if you don't think he even knew what he was talking about, why in the world would you bring this up? But really, pan-cosmic, really? Pan is within the universe, cosmic is within the universe, and this pan is just within the universe. So yeah, okay, body and soul just somehow relate in the universe. Is that really a big deal? I mean, is that really, once it's in existence, it stays in existence? Well, you haven't really said anything.
And the deceptive part about this whole pantheism and the whole idea of, I think the reason it's so deceptive is because, yeah, we are called to be like God. We are called to be, to allow God to reign in us so that we can be divinized. Divinization is like, that's what the church teaches. That's how nature and grace sort of unite on a very practical level.
Grace perfects nature.
Right, yeah, exactly. But, so, yeah, pantheism, God is in everything. Well, God holds everything into existence. He's everywhere in the sense that he holds everything into existence, but he is not everything. I can't worship the camera right in front of me. I can't worship somebody who's very, very holy. I worship God. He holds us all into existence, and I think that's the distinction when you're talking about pantheism, and then when he's talking about all this, divinization, you have to look at that stuff in relation to nature and grace in that relationship. If you don't have a proper understanding of that, or according to what Dietrich von Hildebrand was talking about, how he wanted to throw out the supernatural, then you're going to have a complete misunderstanding of what divinization really is.
Yeah.
For me, for Chardin, everything was matter. And matter is living and vibrant and alive, and the universe is alive, and it's all just a divine, the cosmic dance, basically. And we're part of that. And it's all wonderful and heady, but at the bottom line, the root of it all is this: you will be like unto God. You will become God. You are part of God. And we have to remember that we in our Catholic faith understand that only God was eternal. And the creator and creation are completely and totally separate, that God exists from all eternity, and that he brought ex nihilo from nothing creation into existence. And it's this idea that no matter, this is the evolution, matter itself is eternal. Therefore, matter itself is divine. So if you are a true, like absolute evolutionist, through and through, I don't know how you can get away from pantheism, because matter, and we're all part of that matter material universe, is eternal. Then it's eternal, and the only thing the eternal is God. So it's now godly, godlike.
Well, see, but with all of this, you see, look, and you've got Desjardins, who's coming out with this kind of wackadoodle stuff, and again, it's like, it's very heady, it's very high level, it gets kind of watered down into this thing where you've got this complete lack of distinction. So you've got people being led astray from authentic Catholic doctrine, they're being led away from the worship of God to worship of self, worship of other things. But on the face of it, you think, oh, Desjardins sounds like a really nice guy. Oh, so we're all God, and God is in all of us, and we're all matter, and matter is all things, and we're all connected together. So you would think that he would have some sort of sense of like the universal brotherhood of man, that he would be no. I had a bunch of quotes here from Desjardins, like any good leftist. He is a racist. I shan't say it because we'll get banned on YouTube. But, so, 1929, actual direct quote, do the yellows, by which he meant the Chinese, do the yellows have the same human value as the whites? Licensed and many missionaries say that their present inferiority is due to their long history of paganism. I'm afraid this is only a declaration of pastors. Indeed, the cause seems to be the natural racial foundation. Okay? In 1937, he wrote, at one and the same time, there should be official recognition of the primacy priority of the earth over nations. That's some ecology crap, sounds like. And the inequality of peoples and races. The inequality of peoples and races. Now, the second point is currently reviled by communism and the church, and the first point is similarly reviled by the fascist system. So he's sitting there saying the church needs to change its mind about the fact that people are equal. He also argues for eugenics. To what extent should the earth tolerate racially or nationally areas of lesser activity? More generally still, how should we judge the efforts we lavish in all kinds of hospitals on saving what is so often no more than one of life's rejects? So once again, we're back to eugenic abortion, genocide, etc., etc.
Some matter is more important than other matter,
is more important than other matter.
And some matter hasn't evolved as much as other matter. And that's just the thing. The Holy Mother Church, as a vigilant mother, as a wise mother, as a caring mother, actually looks at these things and says, look, you could probably read 2/3 of this book and not have your Catholic faith, of this particular book, and not have your Catholic faith, harmed too much. You may not get much out of it. It's probably a waste of your time, but you might read it and not have. But there are some things in this other areas where he talks about racism or pantheism or mysticism that's just a bridge to hell, nowhere. And it's going to challenge your faith. It could scandalize you. It could lead you astray. You should not read these things. Put them on the index. Well, the whole modern era, post-Vatican II, I'm not putting Vatican II as the problem, but it's just a marker chronologically from that era forward. Oh no, you can read anything and all this stuff. How come so many people are being led astray? Because all this bad stuff is not being checked. And I really am not on board with the prudential judgment of Pope Francis here, a prudential judgment, which I have a right to not necessarily agree with because I have a reasoning mind, to back a particular quote that may or may not have some point to it or not, and say, oh, that one point, because now you just threw his name up there, and it gets people Googling and what he had, and they grab a book, and they grab that book, and read all this other stuff without any barriers whatsoever.
Well, and that's the key point. You see, I think that's the key point, that what you've got is that people have a limited amount of time to spend reading religious books, and they do. And so somebody may come along and say, well, I'll read this Desjardins fellow, and I've got maybe a couple hours, 2-3 hours, maybe I've got a week, I'll go vacation, whatever, I'm going to read some religious books. And they choose to read Desjardins rather than read, for example, Fulton Sheen, rather than read Aquinas, rather than, do whatever else they were going to do. Because, this isn't just some dude on the internet. This is Father Pierre.
Yeah.
He's got
the collar.
Reverend in front of him. He's got S.J. after his name. Society of Jesus. Why? He's the same society as the Pope. They're well known for their education, all this sort of stuff. See, that's the problem. That, again, this notion of saying, well, here's a list of books that the Catholic Church says you may not read, and it sounds very censorious, and it sounds very bad, and it's all this thing. It's like, no, you've got a limited amount of time. It's like, read something other than this. It's not so much like this is necessarily going to damage your faith. It's just that this read in isolation, if this is all you get, if all you get is this pantheistic, racist claptrap, you're going to have a bad time.
And maybe read sound philosophy before you dive into all these. I mean, even just in general, even reading good theologians, you want to read sound philosophy, read some Aristotle, read whoever, before you dive into deep theology. That'll actually serve as a protection when you are reading guys like Teilhard de Chardin, because you're able to think, you're able to reason through, oh, that doesn't make sense because this. And so I think that would be, reading Aristotle might be.
Yeah. Even having these things on the index, it's not necessarily you shall not read, but hey, knowing that there are problems in this book, and here are your problems. That's what you get from an index. And if the church wants to put that out there, well, I'll look into it, see how bad it is. Where's he coming from? Maybe I want to say from some other side. But at least they put the warning up there that says, hey, be careful because there's things in here that you may find troubling.
And I think that's the mistake that a lot of Catholic schools make. They allow, or they just, they have their students that are, 14, 15, 16 years old, and their consciences are not formed properly, and they have them reading all these books, all these debates about abortion, these debates about homosexuality, these debates about theology, and it's like, well, why don't you just teach them the basics of the faith, and then they can kind of get into all that, maybe sometime after you've taught them just the very basics of what it is that we're trying to teach them. So
they approach it from situational ethics and not from the principles.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Always good. All right. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of The Download. Now, please join us as we finish in prayer, begging Our Lady's intercession for our nation and our church. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae, vita dulcedo et spes nostra salve. Ad te clamamus exules filii Eve. Ad te suspiramus gementes et flentes, in hac lacrimarum vale. Ea ergo advocata nostra, ilos tuos misericordes oculos ad nos converte. Et Iesum benedictum fructum ventris tui, nobis post hoc exilium ostende. O clemens, o pia, o dulcis Virgo Maria. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Thank you again for joining us for The Download. I hope that we gave you some education. If you are looking for some good Catholic books to read, check out our bookstore. We have a load of good stuff. None of it is by de Chardin. Strange that. And, of course, if you're enjoying The Download, remember that we premiere a new episode like this every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. From all of us here at Church Militant, may God bless you.